The moon hung above like a cold, unblinking eye, casting its pale light down upon the earth. The forest below was quiet, unnervingly so, save for the occasional rustling of leaves stirred by an unseen wind, or the ancient creaking of twisted branches that bent and swayed in the dark. The trees were towering sentinels, their gnarled limbs intertwining in a delicate, eerie dance, reaching upward as if to touch something far beyond the heavens. Every trunk whispered its secret. Every leaf murmured a warning, lost to the ages, drowned by the encroaching silence of the night. I walked carefully, my boots sinking into the soft, damp earth with every step. My breath was shallow, quick, like a runner nearing the finish line, but instead of a race, I was running towards something much darker. The air grew colder as I moved deeper into the forest, an unnatural chill that dug into my skin and settled in my bones, as though the forest itself was reaching out to claim me. It felt alive and malevolent, pulsing with an energy I couldn't see but could feel, pressing against me from all sides. I pulled my coat tighter around me, but it did little to shield me from the cold. I couldn't help but shiver, the fear creeping into my soul, but I pushed it down, shoved it back into the depths of my chest, because nothing could stop me now. Nothing but the tree. The ribbon in my pocket felt heavier with each passing moment, as if it were no longer just a simple scrap of crimson fabric, but a weight, a burden, a stone that threatened to pull me under. It had been with me for days, ever since I first heard the stories. Whispers of an ancient tree, a tree that could grant wishes, but at a terrible price. A legend passed down in hushed voices, in fearful glances, as though even speaking its name aloud might summon it into existence. But I didn't believe in myths. I didn't believe in the warnings. I believed in the ache, the unrelenting pain that gnawed at my heart, the emptiness that screamed in my chest day after day. I believed in the hope that I could undo the wrong that had been done, the wrong that had taken my son. Noah, gone. Gone in a flash, in an instant, leaving only that endless void behind. No amount of tears, no amount of time could ever bring him back. The grief had become a part of me, settled in my very bones, dragging me deeper into despair. But there was one way, one final, desperate chance. The wishing tree. I pushed forward through the dense forest, the trees around me growing thicker, darker. My heart was hammering now, loud in my ears, matching the frantic rhythm of my steps. And then, through the trees, I saw it, the wishing tree. My breath caught in my throat and I froze. My heart pounded against my ribcage as if it were trying to escape. My legs felt weak beneath me, but I didn't move. I couldn't. The tree stood there before me, looming, vast, impossibly ancient. Its massive trunk was twisted, gnarled, as though it had been shaped by time itself, by forces beyond comprehension. The bark was dark, ashen gray, gleaming in the moonlight like the surface of a deep, murky pool. Its branches stretched wide, reaching out like skeletal fingers, each one heavy with moss, hanging like the remnants of forgotten memories. The tree pulsed, alive somehow, its presence an unnatural force that thrummed in the air around me. It seemed to be calling to me, pulling me toward it with a force I couldn't resist. It was rooted deep in the earth, as if it had always been here, long before anything else had existed. It had watched, waited, and now it had me. I could feel the pull, a strange hum in the air, vibrating in my chest as I took a step forward. My feet moved of their own accord, dragging me closer to the tree, and the ribbon in my pocket seemed to grow heavier still, its weight pressing down on me. My hands were trembling as I reached into my coat, pulling out the second ribbon. Simple, but to me, it was everything. It was my last hope, my last chance to undo the shattered pieces of my life. I pulled it slowly from my pocket, my fingers brushing against the soft fabric. There was a certainty in my gut, deep in my soul, that this was the moment. This was it. The moment that would change everything. I didn't even think about it. I reached up, my fingers fumbling slightly as I tied the ribbon to one of the tree's gnarled branches. I felt the air still around me as I worked, the tree watching, the forest watching. But I didn't see them. I didn't see the shadows that moved in the corners of my vision, the faces that stared at me from beyond the veil of the trees. All I could hear was the thudding of my own heart and the whisper of the ribbon, brushing against the bark. When I finished, I stood there, my breath caught in my chest. The ribbon fluttered once more, then stilled, its ends curling gently in the windless air. I whispered the words, a prayer, a plea, a desperate cry. Bring him back, bring Noah back. And then the earth groaned. The low sound rumbled from deep within the wishing tree, as though it were waking from a long, silent slumber. The tree's branches groaned, twisting, as the air around me thickened, turning heavy, suffocating. The ground beneath my feet trembled, just slightly at first, but enough to make my heart leap into my throat. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their creaking branches joining the strange, unnatural symphony that filled the air. The wind, which had been absent moments before, stirred the leaves, but there was something wrong about it. It wasn't natural. It was too soft, too whispering, as though the wind itself was trying to speak to me. "Rachel," the voice murmured. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, as if it were coming from everywhere. The wind, the tree, the very forest. Every corner of this place seemed to hum with that one word. Rachel. My breath caught in my throat, and a chill spread through my body. The ribbon fluttered once more, and the shadows around me deepened, coiling like living things. I felt something stir, something ancient, something dark. It was no longer just the wind, it was something far worse, something alive. "Your wish has been made." The voice continued, slower now, more deliberate. "And now, we must wait." And then I knew. I understood, in the pit of my stomach, the horrifying truth. It was too late. The tree had taken my wish. It had taken my soul. The silence that followed my whispered wish pressed down on my chest like thick fog, choking the air from my lungs. For a moment, nothing happened. The ribbon I had tied to the tree hung motionless, its scarlet threads shimmering faintly in the pale moonlight. The forest, once alive with the gentle sounds of the night, seemed to hold its breath. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my ears, my fingers still trembling from the simple act of tying the ribbon. Then, the earth shifted beneath me. At first, it was subtle, a soft tremor that I could feel through my boots. But it was enough to make me glance down. The ground seemed to pulse, as if the roots of the tree were waking, stretching beneath the soil, brushing against the bones of the earth itself. The air grew unnervingly still, the kind of stillness that wraps itself around you like a shroud, suffocating the very sounds of the world. Even the wind, which had been tugging gently at the branches moments before, stilled entirely. Everything was holding its breath. And then, the tree began to move. Not in any natural way. The branches twisted slowly, turning on their axes like fingers curling in slow motion. The bark rippled unnaturally, and the limbs groaned, creaking with a sound that was far too heavy for the fragile, windless night. My stomach churned, and I took a step back, but something invisible held me in place. Some magnetic force, wrapping around my heart, rooting my feet to the earth. A deep, resonant whisper began to echo through the forest. At first, it was so soft, it could have been mistaken for the wind, if not for its rhythmic, almost musical quality. It vibrated in the very air around me, a low, throbbing hum that crawled under my skin and settled deep into my bones. The sound was warm, seductive, drawing me in. I couldn't explain it, but it felt as though it was coaxing me to listen, to understand. It was a voice, though I couldn't place it, coming from everywhere at once. Ancient. Your wish has been heard. Rachel, it has been heard. The whisper of my name caused a chill to crawl down my spine, as if the voice were brushing against the marrow of my bones. It was a voice I could not ignore. And yet, every instinct screamed for me to run, to tear myself away from this tree, this thing that had called to me. But the presence behind the voice was overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on my shoulders, filling the forest with its thick, suffocating energy. Slowly, hesitantly, I turned my eyes back to the tree. The air shimmered before me, the branches swaying in rhythm with the hum that seemed to fill the atmosphere. It was as though the tree were alive, breathing, aware. The ribbon I had tied fluttered with a strange, purposeful energy, its ends curling and twisting in an invisible wind that I couldn't feel, but could sense in the pit of my stomach. "You desire him so much," the voice continued, its tone thick with understanding. "Your son. You wish for him to return to you, to fill the hollow left behind, to ease your pain. But be careful, Rachel. There is no such thing as a wish without cost." My throat tightened. I opened my mouth to speak, to cry out, but no words came. It was as though the very air had thickened around me, suffocating my voice. The tree's branches began to shift again, moving with a slow, deliberate grace, like some unseen hand was manipulating them, coaxing them into a twisted dance of shadows. The air around me grew heavier, thick with an energy I could only describe as hungry. The tree, no, whatever force lay within it, seemed to inhale the very atmosphere, pulling it into itself greedily. The earth trembled once more, but this time it was deeper, as though the roots were stirring from within the very core of the world. A shadow moved across my vision, a flicker, a silhouette that caused my heart to stutter. I turned sharply, but when I looked again, there was nothing. Just the tree, the whisper of that voice, now feeling more like a presence beside me, swirling all around me. "He will come back, Rachel. He will return to you," the voice purred, soft, almost sweet. "But what will you give in exchange? What are you willing to sacrifice for a second chance?" My heart stuttered again, my thoughts spinning. What would I sacrifice? The question echoed in my mind, spinning like a wheel that refused to stop, circling tighter and tighter. The weight of my longing pressed down on me. I could feel it, the force of the tree, its ancient hunger, its power. I had known the stories, had heard the warnings, but in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was Noah, my son. The aching emptiness in my chest, the thought of him, gone forever, twisted me inside. I was willing to do anything to fill that void. "I would give anything," I whispered, my voice trembling, the quiet desperation spilling out, raw and unguarded. Anything. The air around me crackled with energy, thickening, swirling like smoke. The voice responded, deeper now, resonating through my very soul, as though it had touched the deepest corners of my mind. "Then it is done." The words purred through the air, and as they did, the ground beneath my feet shifted again, sending a shockwave of unease through my body. The tree shuddered, its bark rippling, its branches creaking as if some ancient, primal force had been unlocked. My chest tightened. The tremors shook through me, through the very ground beneath me, and I looked up in horror. And there it was. A shape began to form at the base of the tree, twisting, coiling upward from the soil, like smoke taking shape. At first, it was nothing more than a shadow, a whisper of movement in the dark. But as the tree's call grew louder, clearer, the shape began to solidify. Noah. My heart leapt in my chest, but it quickly sank when I saw him. No, it. The figure before me was tall, unnaturally so, and the edges of its form flickered like a mirage. Its eyes, black, hollow, stared at me with a coldness that made my blood freeze. The skin on its face was stretched too tight, the bones too sharp beneath it. It was him, but it wasn't. I opened my mouth to speak, to call his name, but no sound came. My hands trembled violently as I reached for him. The creature before me, no, the thing, lifted its hand. A grotesque imitation of the gesture a child might make when reaching out to its mother. Slowly, it stepped toward me, and then, in that moment, I knew. I had made a terrible mistake. The tree had delivered my wish, but at what cost? And as the creature reached for me, the whispers from the forest grew louder, darker, suffocating me in the cold embrace of the wishing tree's call. Ella appeared before me like a shadow that had stepped right out of my worst nightmare. She moved slowly, almost hesitantly, her eyes never leaving the twisted, grotesque figure that I had unintentionally called forth from the depths of the wishing tree. Her skin, once pale and radiant, was now ashen, like the very bark of the tree itself, stretched too thin over the hollow cavity of her bones. Her clothes hung loosely on her frail body, the fabric battered and worn, as though it had been dragged through this haunted forest for years. She looked like she had never truly lived, but only endured. Her dark, limp hair clung to her face like something forgotten, left to rot. There was no warmth in her gaze, just emptiness. It stretched back, deep into a past she couldn't escape. My heart raced, a mixture of terror and pity swelling in my chest. This woman, this ghost, was familiar to me. I had heard the stories, the hushed whispers in the villages surrounding the forest. Ella, a mother who had made the same wish, a mother who had paid the same price. Ella. My voice trembled as I called to her. I wanted to reach out, grab her, shake her, force her to answer the questions that burned inside me. What happened to you? What happened to your daughter? Ella's lips twitched, but it wasn't a smile. It was the faintest grimace, a silent acknowledgement of the sorrow that had worn her down, hollowing her out until there was nothing left of the woman she once was. I shouldn't be here, she whispered, her voice ragged, struggling to make its way past the thickness in her throat. Her hands, trembling violently, pressed against her chest as if trying to steady herself against some invisible storm. You don't understand. You don't know what it feels like to wish for something, and then watch it all crumble. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The figure of Noah, the hollow echo of my son, stood motionless before me. His black eyes were locked onto mine, unblinking, unfeeling. It was him, but it wasn't. The very thought of him twisted my stomach in knots. I could almost hear his voice, but the words never came, only an unbearable silence. Ella, what happened to your daughter? My voice cracked as I asked again, louder this time, desperate. I needed answers. The agony inside me demanded them. You must tell me, please. Ella turned her eyes away from me. Her hands were trembling as she wiped away the faint tears that had started to pool at the corners of her eyes. But there were no more tears. Only the ghost of a woman trying to hold herself together in the face of a horror that could never be undone. She glanced away from me, toward the wishing tree. Her gaze lingered on it for a long, silent moment. "It took her," Ella whispered, the words barely audible as if they were poison. "The tree took her from me." Her voice cracked, and she let out a shuddering breath, the very memory of what she had done threatening to break her apart. I thought I could have her back. I thought if I tied a ribbon to its branch, if I made my wish, it promised me. Ella cerró los ojos, y yo vi sus manos apretadas con fuerza a su lado, temblando con el peso de memorias demasiado dolorosas para soportar. Her breath was shallow, the pain etched so deeply into her face that I couldn't look away, even though it felt as if my heart was being crushed under the weight of her words. "It gave me Lily," Ella continued, her voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking louder would somehow summon the nightmare once again. "But she wasn't my daughter, not really. She looked like her. But her eyes were different. Cold. Empty. And when I held her, it wasn't the warmth of my little girl. It was the chill of something hollow, something that had never been alive." I staggered backward, my pulse quickening as the air around me seemed to turn to ice. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What happened to her?" Ella turned her eyes toward me for the first time, and I saw something in them, something so dark, so full of regret, that it sent a shiver down my spine. "The tree doesn't give. It takes. It doesn't bring anyone back. It just replaces them. It takes your soul, your hope, and feeds on it until there's nothing left of you but the empty shell of a wish." Her voice cracked on that last word. Her eyes blurred as she seemed to lose herself in the memory. Her shoulders shook violently, and I could feel the raw sorrow emanating from her like a physical force. It was suffocating. It was unbearable. There was no escaping the depth of grief, regret, and guilt that had become her prison. Ella paused, fighting to control the sob that threatened to break free. "I thought it would be enough. I thought I could fix it. But the tree, it doesn't care. It feeds on your despair. It twists your wish and uses your suffering to become stronger, until there's nothing left of you but an empty shell, clinging to a dream that was never real. Lily is gone." Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands, as though shielding herself from the blow that would never stop coming. My breath caught in my throat as the weight of her words began to sink in. The reality of what the wishing tree was, and what it had done to Ella, clawed at my insides, gnawing at me with every word she spoke. "I did it to myself," Ella whispered hoarsely, her voice cracking under the strain. "I thought I could make it right. I thought the tree would help. But I was wrong. You don't know what it's like, Rachel. You don't know what it feels like to beg for your child back, only to have something worse come in their place." I looked down at the figure of Noah, standing before me, his hollow eyes staring back at me with that same cold emptiness. My chest tightened with a pain that was almost too much to comprehend, and I shook my head in horror. "I didn't know." Ella's voice was barely audible, as though the admission was too much for her to bear. "But you do. And once you make that wish, there's no going back. There's no redemption." I took a hesitant step back, and Ella's words sank into my chest like a stone. Her face was hollow, gaunt, a woman lost to her own regret. The rawness of her pain was laid bare, exposed for the world to see. And I knew then that I had made the same mistake. The wishing tree, once a place of hope and promise, was nothing more than a monster, feeding on the souls of those foolish enough to believe in its lies. And I had just become its next victim. The silence shattered, and I felt it reverberate through every bone in my body. A low, guttural growl echoed through the clearing. It rumbled from deep within the wishing tree itself, beginning as a murmur, but growing louder, louder, until it was a deafening roar that rattled the very bones of the forest. The ground beneath my feet quaked violently, sending sharp tremors up my spine. I stumbled, my knees buckling beneath the force of the tremor. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold chill snake down my back. The tree. It was alive. The air grew thick, suffused with a malevolent energy that crawled under my skin. It felt as if the atmosphere itself was pressing in from all sides, squeezing the life from me. The temperature plummeted, so sudden, so brutal, that it felt as if the breath of death itself had swept through the forest. The sky above darkened, thick clouds swirling and boiling, twisting into unnatural shapes that seemed to pulse with an ominous rhythm. My heart hammered against my ribcage as the branches of the wishing tree shifted, groaning and creaking like the bones of a dying giant. The bark rippled like liquid, an unnatural wave of movement spreading from the base to the highest limbs, twisting, distorting the very shape of the tree. The once solid form of the tree now seemed to twist in ways that were impossible, as if its essence itself were being pulled and warped by some unseen hand. And then I heard it. A whisper. Faint at first, but it grew louder, curling into every corner of the forest, crawling into my mind. You wanted him back. You wanted your son. The voice was no longer gentle or coaxing. It was dark, mocking. A distortion of the same voice that had promised me everything. It was the voice of the tree itself, the thing that had waited for centuries, feeding on the despair and broken hearts of those who sought its power. Now, it was no longer a whisper in the wind. It was a roar, a deafening scream that clawed at the edges of my sanity, raking through my mind like a jagged blade. I pressed my hands to my ears, desperate to block out the noise, but it was inside my head, inescapable, suffocating. I turned toward the twisted figure of Noah, the hollow mockery of my son, still standing before me, his lifeless eyes locked onto mine. His mouth opened, and from it spilled a low, guttural sound, like a breath from the grave. It was far too familiar. Mom. The word was a shadow, a twisted echo of what Noah once sounded like, but there was nothing human in the voice that crawled from his lips. His skin was sickly gray, stretched tight over bones that seemed to jut out unnaturally. It was as if his body wasn't meant to hold such a thing. His form was wrong, a mockery of the child I had lost. My stomach twisted, and I reached toward him, my hands shaking violently. "Noah?" I whispered, my voice trembling with both hope and terror. "No, please, come back to me." But the figure didn't move. Instead, the ground beneath me buckled again, and the air thickened with a deep, unnatural hunger. The earth groaned, and a massive tendril, black and gnarled like the roots of the wishing tree, burst from the ground at my feet. It was alive, writhing and twisting with malevolent force, intent on consuming me whole. I screamed as the tendril coiled around my ankles, yanking me off my feet. My hands scraped against the cold earth as I tried to reach out, but the tree's grip was too strong. The branches overhead stretched toward me like skeletal hands, their gnarled fingers closing in with terrifying speed. I could feel the cold of the tree's touch seep into my skin, colder than death itself. It froze my very soul. My vision blurred, my chest tightening as the weight of the forest seemed to bear down on me. The hunger, no, the fury of the tree clawed at me, an ancient and unstoppable rage. The voice came again, louder now, dark with contempt. "You wanted him back, but you cannot have him. He was never yours to take." I writhed in the tree's grip, but my strength was failing. I could feel the tree's power seep into me, a cold, twisting pressure that crushed the air from my lungs. The tendrils of the tree tightened around me, pulling me toward the trunk, where the gaping maw of its core seemed to pulse with an eerie light, like a dark wound in the very heart of the forest. From the depths of the tree, something rose. Something darker, older than the wishing tree itself. A presence so heavy, so oppressive, it filled the space around me, surrounding me with an overwhelming force. The shadow stretched and twisted, growing larger, consuming the light. It was nothingness. A hunger so deep, so endless, it swallowed everything in its path. The tree groaned again, its bark splitting and cracking like a wound, and from the center of it, a pair of glowing, malevolent eyes appeared. They stared down at me, ancient and unfeeling. Pools of darkness gleamed with the light of 1,000 lost souls. It saw me, and in those eyes I saw the reflection of my own desperation, my grief, my aching emptiness, and the terrible truth. The wishing tree had never promised to give me anything. It had only waited for me to come, to offer myself willingly. It fed not on wishes but on despair, on the raw pain of those who sought it out. And now it had me, body and soul. The figure of Noah flickered again, distorting, warping with every passing moment. His face changed, contorted into a mask of agony, a twisted expression that I couldn't bear to look at. His mouth opened again, and this time the voice was different. It wasn't Noah's voice. It was the tree, its voice wrapped in the sound of 1,000 lost souls. You were never meant to have him back. You were meant to serve me. And then, with a sound like the breaking of bones, the tree's tendrils yanked me closer to its gaping maw, pulling me toward the heart of its dark core. My body was no longer my own. The wishing tree's wrath had consumed me, and I was nothing more than a puppet, pulled into the dark, cold embrace of its insatiable hunger. My scream, my final cry of desperation, was swallowed by the darkness. The darkness was absolute. I could feel the air press down on me, thick and heavy. Every breath came in shallow gasps, each one harder to take. The earth beneath me was cold, damp, but it wasn't the chill that numbed my limbs. It was the weight of the curse, the suffocating power of the tree that clung to me like a second skin. My body no longer responded to my frantic attempts to escape. Every movement grew slower, more labored, as though the very air around me was thickening, binding me in place. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence that surrounded me. Silent, save for the pulse of the tree's heartbeat, steady, relentless. I glanced up, my gaze flickering through the tangled branches above me, and I saw the faint, ghostly glow of the moon through the shifting canopy. The forest that had once seemed so full of life, so full of possibility, was now a distant memory. It had been reduced to nothing more than a cold, hollow shell. The trees loomed like sentinels, watching silently as the wishing tree consumed me. Noah. I could still see him, his hollow eyes, that faint flicker of recognition that had once danced across his face, but it was gone now, replaced by something far darker, far more unsettling. The shadow of my son was no longer a child. It was an empty vessel, a corpse in a form that resembled what once was. He was not coming back. I knew that now, deep in my soul. The wishing tree had given me something far worse than the comfort I had craved. It had promised a return, but instead, it had taken. And the price was being revealed in full. The roots of the tree, thick and grotesque, pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, like the veins of some ancient, sentient creature. They wrapped around my legs, binding me tighter with every breath I took. The bark, once smooth and dark, now seemed to shift, bending and stretching in ways that were impossible. The air grew colder still, and an unbearable pressure settled over my chest, as though the very weight of the tree was pressing down on my heart. You wanted him back. the voice came again, a deep, resonant growl that echoed through the marrow of my bones. "But you do not understand, Rachel. You were never meant to have him back." The voice was thick, malevolent, a distorted version of the whispers I had heard earlier. But now, there was something else to it, something far more sinister. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, writhing in the very fibers of the tree, embedded in its roots, its branches, the very earth beneath me. It was as though the tree's voice was the voice of the forest itself, ancient and without mercy. "You gave yourself to me when you tied that ribbon. You offered yourself. You offered your sorrow, your grief, your soul. And now, I take it all." My breath hitched as the words began to sink in. I could feel the suffocating weight of the tree's grip tightening around me, the cold, wet bark seeping into my skin, into my very bones. My body trembled, and for a moment I felt a spark of resistance, a flicker of the woman I once was, before the pain, before the grief, before the wishing tree. But it was short-lived. The power of the tree was overwhelming, its hunger insatiable. It had fed on my grief, on my desperate desire to undo the tragedy that had torn my life apart. It had promised me the return of my son, but it had delivered only despair. And now it was collecting the price. My eyes darted frantically from the tendrils that ensnared my legs to the twisted figure of Noah, still standing before me, his body flickering in and out of existence like a shadow at the edge of my vision. The tree was not finished with me yet. What did it want from me? What more could it take? Suddenly, the earth beneath me cracked open with a sickening sound. From the rift, dark, smoky tendrils began to rise, swirling and coiling with unnatural force. The air was heavy with the scent of something rotten. Decay, the stench of death itself. It seeped into my lungs, filling me with a sickness so deep I could taste it. The smoke thickened around me, and I felt my body grow heavier, my limbs turning to lead, too weak to move. The price of a wish, I realized with sickening clarity, was never paid in a single moment. It was paid over time, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the person who had made the wish. The wishing tree didn't just take what was offered. It hollowed out the person who sought it, piece by piece, until the wish was a faded memory, and the wisher was nothing more than a vessel, a hollow shell. My chest constricted as I tried to scream again, but no sound came. The air around me thickened, suffocating, until it felt as though the very atmosphere had turned to stone. I could feel the tree feeding, its roots digging deeper into the earth, and deeper into my soul. And then, from the shadows, something else emerged, a shape, a figure, standing just beyond the reach of the dark, smoky tendrils. It was a woman. Her face was gaunt, hollowed with despair, her eyes sunken into her skull. She stood there, flickering in the darkness like a broken mirror. Ella. My heart seized in my chest as I recognized her, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and recognition. Ella's mouth opened, and my breath caught in my throat. "You made the same mistake I did." Her voice was low, ragged, a tortured whisper that tore through the thick silence. "You came here looking for something you could never have. You bargained with something you couldn't understand. And now you'll pay the price." Her form flickered again, as though she were slipping between worlds. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I saw the depth of pain there, an endless, bottomless sorrow that reflected my own heart. "The tree never grants wishes, Rachel." Ella's voice cracked. "It feeds on the wish. It takes what it desires, and it leaves you hollow. The price is your soul." Her words hit me like a physical blow, the truth I had fought so desperately to avoid. The truth I could no longer deny. I had given everything for this. For a moment with Noah, for a life that could never return, and now the tree would take everything else. The earth rumbled beneath me, and with a final, horrifying lurch, I felt the roots of the wishing tree pull me deeper into the abyss. I could feel myself being pulled apart, my essence ripped from my body, consumed by the ravenous hunger of the tree. My body was nothing now, a vessel, a shell. And as the darkness closed in, the only thing left was the unbearable truth. The wishing tree never gave. It only took, and my soul was the final price.